G'day everyone. Thank you for listening to this lecture discussing the Bonegilla Migrant Reception and Training Centre. This site, an often missed or misrepresented part of Australia's migration history, will be used as a prism through which we can critically view certain celebratory narratives of Australia's multicultural heritage. We may, via Bonegilla, understand the process towards a multicultural society not as explicitly harmonious as it is frequently purported to be, but rather as a nuanced, flawed, plural, fluid and continuous project. It is this grey area which Bonegilla itself inhabits, and this grey area which I will demonstrate to be characteristic of Australian migration narratives more generally. Specifically, our guiding question on this journey will be, how can we use Bonegilla to complicate celebratory narratives of Australia's migrant heritage and multicultural goals? It's a question on the slide, after all. And it is through this framing that we will problematise Bonegilla as the birthplace of multiculturalism, as it has sometimes been extolled to be, and thus allow its multivocal potential to flower. So, to begin, what was the Bonegilla migrant camp? Located along the Murray River and a mere 12 kilometres from Wodonga in northeastern Victoria, the site was an old army barracks, repurposed for the entry and hosting of new Australians, that is, specifically non-British European migrants following the Second World War. It operated from 1947 to 71, with intake occurring virtually continuously throughout this period. It was largely administrated by ex-army officers, such as the Colonel, the handsome chap on the bottom right-hand side. The Colonel is a caricature from a YouTube video produced by the Bonegilla Migrant Experience, the museum of sorts now existing on the site, as part of their corpus of didactic materials. The camp was set up to host survivors and escapees out of dislocated Europe, refugees seeking greater tidings in the bucolic and purportedly plentiful Australian outback. Indeed, historian Paul Ashton frames these migrants as the nation's pioneers in said outback, facing hardship and the vicissitudes of nature that would help forge their new character, a crucially Australian character, and, incidentally, a character complementary to the immigratory goals of the Ben Chifley government. What a coincidence. These migrants sought to make a fresh start, and the government located them at a sufficient distance from the metropolitan areas as to be convenient to rural employment. Many of these migrants worked on nearby farmsteads and even bigger initiatives such as the Snowy Mountain Scheme from 1949 to 74, a hydroelectric undertaking integral to the industrialisation of regional Australia and, as recognised by the Australian government, an endeavour powered largely by migrant labour. All passing through Bonegilla were required to work for 2 years under contract with the Australian government, a condition causing considerable bitterness for those assigned work outside of their chosen fields. Australia needed labourers following the war and the depredation of the young Australian population. Many soldiers died, and the population was waning, with fertility below replacement level amidst the penury and moral crisis. In the words of Sir Tasman Hayes, the displaced persons needed to be found employment in country districts to bolster an alien Australian economy. Indeed, per historian James Jupp, the roots of change grew out of war conditions which then shaped the lives of these post-war migrants. Relevant to these post-war migrants, poet Mara Ronald sarcastically references the choice which these new Australians demonstrated in electing to come to Australia. The migrants needed Australia as much as Australia did them, and they went where they could. Many of these European migrants were not Australia's first choice, being from origins not British during Anglocentric Chifley and Robert Menzies governments, and nor was Australia the perceived ideal for these migrants. Migrants like Manfred Reich, who will be discussed later. The Minister of the then new Department of Immigration, Arthur Calwell, promised verbatim in 1945 that for every foreign migrant there would be 10 British, though this did not eventuate. Menzies ceded that Australia would have to postpone our attack upon the migration problem until all our domestic and economic problems had been solved. The dissonance between Australia's ideal migrants and the migrants they received came through strongly, with one migrant noting they believed Bonegilla was designed to transform our mentality, our spiritual and mental condition, to the standardised pattern of the average Australian. There was a process of Australianisation occurring here. These aspersions of Bonegilla as a re-education camp of sorts come across quite strongly when you consider the material conditions of the site. As an ex-military encampment, it was a sea of tents and rudimentary, semi-permanent structures. It was originally designed to house the military, to train them, and undoubtedly to toughen them up, in a conveniently cost-effective fashion for the architects. One wouldn't be remiss in positing a similar goal of toughening up was intended for these new migrants. Families were housed in groups in cubbyhole-sized cubicles, some measuring a meagre 4 by 3 metres. Further, families could be separated as breadwinners were sent to venues of employment and dependents either remained at Bonegilla or were sent to holding camps elsewhere. For this new brand of migrants, a massive cast of individuals with, according to Australian demographer W.D. Borry, an unprecedented lack of social, economic, or cultural security in the postmodern era, the Minister of the Department of Immigration, Arthur Caldwell, and his claims that Australia will help newcomers to become assimilated would simply have to be taken as a promise. Some simply weren't in a position to doubt, let alone refuse. Historian Glenda Sluga perhaps summarises Bonegilla's unique telos most succinctly. It was to be used as a staging camp for processing migrants. Voluntary and refugee migrants who had exchanged 2 years of their labour for assisted or free passage could be railed from Bonegilla to remote areas of the Australian continent, to be placed in jobs Australians did not want to do, away from metropolitan centres and in critical areas of the economy. It would also be a place where these migrants were to be Australianised, given training in the English language, and familiarised with the Australian way of life. Lovely bell. But what of this Australianisation? How are we supposed to interpret that in the modern day, in a multicultural Australia? This doesn't seem very multicultural. In fact, it seems quite extractive. Labour in, heritage and culture out. But did this Australianisation even work? What about the Melbourne Herald's words in 1971, the last year of the camp's operation? Bonegilla was a babble of different tongues, an uneasy simmering of passions, hopes and fear, a psychiatrist's casebook of problems, a romantic novelist's dreams of love that led to weddings in a foreign land. It was a little Europe in a bleak, improbable setting of 1941 army huts and gum trees under the hot southern sun. So Bonegilla didn't make Australians, it was just a little Europe, a transplanted cultural outpost. According to Australian historian Joy DeMusi, the policies subtending and ensconcing Bonegilla disavowed a multidimensional identity. The process of Australianisation precluded identities from the past remaining intact, but it seems that they do here. Which was it? Was it a side of monoculture? Or an instance of plurality, of cultural plurality? But we're losing sight of the topic here. Frankly, how much can Bonegilla be understood with just a few secondary sources and a handful of plucks from parliamentary minutes and correspondences between the residing bigwigs? The real story of Bonegilla lies in the histories of those who experienced it. It is only with these authentic, true, personal, human, and potent stories that we may gain a view of Bonegilla useful for us to approach the question laid out at the beginning of this lecture. Let's pass through some of the past lives of the people who called this place their home and find ourselves at the lived experience of Manfred Reich, a former resident of Bonegilla, whose story is now publicly accessible thanks to the works of his son Simon Reich, including a feature-length film shown in cinemas across Victoria. Manfred moved to Australia in 1952 from a post-World War II Germany bereft of nearly everything, with no money, no jobs. Australia was, prima facie, heaven for Reich. Its splendid and spacious outback was idyllic compared to the cramped and then levelled industrial district of Berlin, wherefrom he hailed. Manfred was one of the latter waves of Arthur Caldwell's Beautiful Bolts program, a moniker attributed to classically white-presenting, Anglo-similar, from at least a phenotypical perspective, Eastern European migrants who were sold to the general Australian populace as crucially not British, but the next best thing. Caldwell's program indicated a clear ethnic picking order, a symptom of a nation still administered under the White Australia policy. The government picked those migrants who were deemed least likely to offend native-born Australians. Clearly, Caldwell was determined to pick only the best and the healthiest of the refugees. He wanted those immediately inductible into the labour force, and those also highly reproductive. Manfred and his fellow migrants were posited as a solution to the Australian problem of the time. For those paying attention, however, Manfred wasn't really a beautiful Bolt. He wasn't Baltic, he was German. And he wasn't alone in this contradiction. It is approximated that only 35,000 of the 170,000 individuals brought in under Arthur Caldwell's Beautiful Bolts program from 1947 to 52 actually hailed from the Baltic districts. The rest came from myriad other European nations. As long as they were close enough to Australia's British alignment, they were allowed passage, provided they were happy to serve their 2 years quasi-indentured labour in transaction. So, returning to Manfred. He'd made his way to Australia and he was initially excited. He was ready to capitalise on these prospects for a better life. Unfortunately, this idealism was short lived, where within the first 10 days we had 3 people dead from heatstroke, snakes, and barbed wire in the lake left over from military training exercises, causing people to get tangled and drown. Here is a morbidly fitting metaphor. The lake, representative of Australian society, poses itself as inviting, but conceals lurking dangers hidden beneath the surface. On the hospitality front, the shocking and terrible cooks famously boiled lamb until it was more than dead. Figure 10 shows Manfred's face recounting this episode of Epicurean affront. The Australian palate would take a bit of getting used to for him, clearly. So would the authoritarianism displayed by the camp officials and the bureaucracy damning the process of job acquisition. Manfred recounts protesting on multiple occasions to no avail, apart from one instance where he and his friends were allowed to cook dinner for their section of the camp for a singular night. These protests were not exclusive to Manfred. There were recorded riots in 1952 and again in 1961. Manfred's experience of Bonegilla, holistically, is nuanced. He enjoyed some aspects and he abhorred others. His recollections reflect this. They're told from his dream house in Wangaratta, where he lives with his wife, who he let at Bonegilla, and Wangaratta being the outpost where he was initially assigned labour as an upholsterer in 1952. His time there wasn't perfect, but it was, for Manfred, home for a short while. Paralleling Manfred Reich is Romulus Gaeta, a Romanian carpenter who arrived in Bonegilla in 1950 with his 4-year-old son Raymond and his wife Christine in tow. Romulus's story is told through the eyes of Raymond in his 1998 retrospective Romulus, My Father. Upon arriving at Bonegilla, Romulus's father was sent to Barringap in central Victoria to work on the construction of Cairn Curran, a reservoir being built to dam the Loddon River, thus leaving Christine and Raymond at Bonegilla, awaiting his return. Despite being a qualified blacksmith, Romulus was, like many others, utilised only for menial manual tasks. Aspersions had been cast by the government on the veracity of these migrants' tertiary qualifications. It was no use their showing diplomas to employers, as according to UN social worker Murphy, who travelled with these migrants, everyone in Australia knew they had been bought on the black market in Europe. So, Romulus, despite this learned aptitude, suffered from the native Australians' prejudice against the new Australians. He couldn't find work in his chosen field and thus took whatever labour was available. Romulus's story, perhaps more acutely than Manfred's, captures the feelings of dislocation and desolation felt by many migrants passing through Bonegilla. With his adulterous wife and petty thieving son trapped at the intake camp, and the little visible enthusiasm radiating from the locals for hiring Romulus, as per a contemporaneous newspaper article, Romulus's heart hardened to this new environment. Romulus's account poignantly expresses Romulus's recalcitrance to the Australian environment. The luscious outback became synecdoche for everything different to home in Germany, for all the certainties lost, and for the harsh work he completed as penance for the gift of coming to Australia. Romulus became typical of many of the immigrants, whose eyes looked directly to the foliage and turned away always offended. Romulus didn't get a Heimat, the German term for homeland, despite Corwell's best pamphleteering efforts to market it in such a manner. Romulus lost his wife to suicide in 1954, and sadly took his own life in 1996. Unfortunately, Romulus's story is not unique. These feelings of ennui, dislocation, listlessness, uprootedness, fragmentation, and disintegration pervade many migrants' accounts of their time passing through Bonegilla. Many of these migrants never found their shared public, as per the writings of Alexandra Delios. From Glenda Sluger, the national dream which Corwell sold to migrants regarding Bonegilla conjured all these possibilities for an existence in a new engineered dream of Australia, and this potential, unfulfilled or fulfilled, changed the lives of those who were meant to live said dream. But this romantic ideal, one of regeneration of ethnicity which Bonegilla was predicated upon, it didn't come true for everyone. Manfred and Romulus's stories tell us that much. So, with these true human stories in mind, what are we left with? What is Bonegilla's true legacy? We're left with a divided image. We're left with this ambiguous image, and fundamentally, we're left with an image which neither posits Australia as absolutely multicultural, nor solely committed to the creation of a monoculture. Bonegilla doesn't complement celebratory narratives, but nor does it controvert them. It complicates them. Retrospectively, it's easy to see Bonegilla as an attempted site of extraction, attempted dispossession, and attempted homogenization, a side of cleansing their minds, as per the Sydney Morning Herald in 1947. The concession attempted is important here, because the stories of Manfred and Romulus, among the hundreds of thousands of others, attest a retention of culture and are not uniformly negative. There's a latitude for nuance at Bonegilla. This was a site of resistance. Colonel Gwyn, administrator of the camp for much of its operation, claims there was never outstanding problems with immigration at the centre, or assimilation in the centre, but the riots of 1952 and 61 attest a very different story. John Alexander Pettit, member for Hume in 1964, and his celebration of valuable Australian citizens displaying their many nationalities proudly at Bonegilla, is attractive now as a sentiment, but was this truly the goal way back then? Australia wasn't looking for cultural plurality. They sought the king's men and the king's women, as Menzies urged, and when they couldn't get them, they worked to engineer them. As per Delios's work, public proclamations about the success of Bonegilla and the progressive migrants' cultural tenacity and social mobility are commonplace in the academy regarding Australia's migration history. Celebratory narratives are a dime a dozen because they serve a political utility. But without an understanding of the troubling stories of callousness, neglect, and incompetence which Bonegilla inflicted, stories understood through the Manfreds and the Romuluses of the Training and Reception Centre, we end up with superficially cohesive and positive narratives and forgotten, voiceless past lives. It is the stories of Manfred and Romulus which allow us to resituate Bonegilla outside of modern frameworks, colonising the history of Bonegilla for socio-political gain and consistency. In forgetting that Australia only took these migrants because of a labour shortage and exhortations from the UN on grounds of humanitarian reasons, we inflict a simplicity which negates meaningful contour. In the words of Peter Mayers, we exist in an Australia built upon an assumption of continuity regarding multiculturalism. But Bonegilla forces us to question that. That can be an uncomfortable process. It brings into question Australians' identity, then and now. Where do these second-class entrants with few rights, in the words of historian Eric Richards, fit in these glorious synthetic narratives? If Chifley, Caldwell, and Menzies considered these migrants a temporary aberration in Australia's cultural makeup, as Britain was unable to supply enough people, does Bonegilla indicate genuine multiculturalism? Bluntly, no. The celebratory narratives perverting it indicate an importation of a simplified, conventionally attractive narrative of inherited plurality in the government's dogma. It indicates an obfuscation of truth and an assumption of positivity because it fits the current agenda. Manfred and Romulus's stories have been lost, or rather disposed of, for they have no place. Delios, referencing the works of Neumann and Tavan, notes that immigration history is commonly valued only insofar as it relates to the unifying narratives of the nation-state. So, in an Australia predicated upon plurality, and an Australia loosening its ties to the anchor of British political, national, and cultural heritage, multiculturalism became a necessary ideology, and, far from undermining national identity and cohesion, it quickly became the new way of defining Australianness and the nation. Multiculturalism is an axiom of Australia's perceived identity. But this ideology of multiculturalism, as positive and bright and shiny as it represents itself to be, it isn't faithful to the truth of Bonegilla. From Priya Sarcher's work, Time's Monster, we learn that the forgotten and silenced truth is supplanted with myth. Sadly, it is these myths which frame the modern understanding of Bonegilla. So what have we learnt? How do we look at Bonegilla conscientiously? In doing this project and this subject, my capstone for my history major, we had weekly assigned readings, which everyone naturally read, including me. Many of these readings focused on the idea of public history, as well as the functions of memory framing and creation. One of them provides particular insight here. It's a work by David Dean, which discusses the benefit of perspective and a holistic scope. Bonegilla can so easily be seen as a site of horrible mistreatment, or it can be glorified, as the Australian narrative tends toward, as an outpost of cultural plurality amidst the White Australia policy. But Dean, perhaps, might encourage the opposite. The quote that spoke to me personally reads as follows: "Real understanding comes from seeing things differently. In parts and fragments, they can be put together in one way or another, or not at all. This attitude applies beautifully to the Bonegilla Migrant Reception and Training Centre. Without the dissonance between its extractive migrant policies and the parallel celebration of its visionary and ultimately successful goals of multicultural assimilation," an oxymoron if ever there was one, we can see the site for what it was. Bonegilla has been historicised to fit within the framework of a continuous, naturalised narrative of a consistent Australian multiculturalism, but that just ain't so. Bonegilla's narrative does not inherently possess any boundaries, structures, or regularities, nor can it or should it be made to fit them. Bonegilla was made of people like Manfred and Romulus. The works of Simon Reich and Raymond Gator in uncovering the lives of their fathers are imperative. We should not inflict modern political aspirations onto an otherwise authentic and potent source of Australian immigratory heritage. Bonegilla doesn't corroborate a homogenous, neatly packaged narrative of Australia's journey to multiculturalism. Bonegilla doesn't fit this fake, harmonious narrative. That is not what Bonegilla was and is. Bonegilla is uncertain. It is grey. It is human. And perhaps most importantly, it doesn't fit neatly within any box or narrative. It is real. Thank you for listening.